guys should brought that in for you. Yeah.
Abigail,
I don't get to be in.
Abigail, I can only see the left side of the room.
Okay, This
I
camera
can see
is-
from Brad to the left, but
Welcome
I
to
can't
the
see
Lions
any of
Den.
the right
Thank
side.
you. Yeah, it's just baptism by fire, I guess.
yeah, it's always a trouble with this room. You can't always get everyone in the picture. Is that a little better?
Yes, it is. Thank you.
Me too.
I'm just introducing myself, Allison Frazier.
Oh, so nice to meet you. I'm Andrea.
Andrew, nice to meet you as well.
Me too.
I'm Chittenden County.
Great. I think I checked a deer in for you one year.
Into what?
I checked a deer in. Jericho in here. I just
You know
remember.
what?
I remember your name.
Now that you say that, look who's here.
So cool. Nice to see you.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah.
Sorry, biologist. Yeah, good. I didn't realize that.
Yes. Yeah. Brian, nice to meet you. Yeah, me too. Neil, great. Nice to meet you. And I need to start learning everyone's names.
Abigail, we all set? We are, okay. Is Linda there? Or do you know or no?
I am. I just called in.
Oh, okay, Linda, thank you. Okay, good evening, everybody. My name is Brad Ferlin. I'm the chair of the Fish and Wildlife Board, and welcome to our December meeting of the Fish and Wildlife Board. I'd like to start the meeting by having the members that are present introduce themselves. We'll start over here with you, Paul.
Paul Noel, Orleans County.
Brian Bailey, Washington County.
Neil Hogan, Bennington County.
Bob Patterson, Addison County.
Brad Ferlin, Caledonia County.
Martin Van Buren, Rutland County.
Beth Heimling, Grand Isle County. Allison Frazier, Chittenden County.
Michael Bancroft, Orange County.
And online,
David
Linda
Dean,
Hook.
Wyndham County.
Linda Hook, Essex County.
Jay Sweeney, Franklin County.
Nick Burnham, Windsor County.
okay, great. All members are present. And we have a vacancy from Lamoille County at this point. So there are 13 of us participating. Okay, the next thing I'd like to do is to turn it over to our new commissioner and welcome Andrea Shortsleeve and have her introduce herself and the staff that's present.
Great, thank you. Hi, my name is Andrea Shortsleeve. I'm the interim commissioner of Fish and Wildlife. So I'll introduce, I guess, the staff here. Katie, if you want to go ahead.
Hi, I'm Katie Geeter. I'm the bionutrition and research manager for Vermont Fish and Wildlife.
I'm Chris Bernier. I'm a wildlife biologist working out of the Springfield District Office.
David Soslow, Program Manager with the Wildlife Management Section.
John Austin. I'm the director of the Wildlife Division.
Bree Furphy, the Fur Bearer Projects Leader. I'm Nicola, Upland Game Bird Biologist. I'm Hannah Smith, General Counsel. Abigail Connolly, Principal Assistant to Commissioner. And
Sean Fowler, Major for the Warden Service.
Robert Courier. I'm the lieutenant for the Northwest Supervisory District. Asa Sargent. I'm one of the wardens in the Northwest Supervisory District.
And do we have any staff online attending remotely?
Yep, Allie Thomas, the director of the Outreach Division.
I'm Mary Beth Adler. I'm the Fur Bearer Program Technician for a few more days.
Is that a retirement? It is.
It is. Yes.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
She will be greatly missed.
Okay, thank you. If that's it, everybody, thank you very much. The first item on the agenda is the approval of the minute meetings from October 16th. If everybody's had a chance and Anybody has any questions or additions?
Make a motion to approve the meetings, the minutes from the October meeting.
I'll second it.
Okay, I have a motion and a second to approve. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Okay, opposed? Okay, ayes have it. Our next item on the agenda is the public comments section. And this is part of the meeting where we give members of the public 2 minutes to speak on any subject they would like to. And it's not a back and forth with members. It's just your ability to have the time to speak. And is there a sign up list? There's, okay, let me grab that. Thank you. So as of right now, I have 3 individuals at least in the room that want to take advantage of the 2 minutes. So first is Matt Anderson from Orwell. Matt, welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, my name is Matt Anderson from Orwell, Addison County. Thanks for having me. Thanks to everybody in the room and all the service that you provide. I appreciate that. I'm here to speak. My background in this forum is I'm a licensed lease tracker. Been a licensed lease tracker for 5 years. We're far from experts, but we are active. In those 5 years, we've probably been on about 200 tracks, maybe 60, 65 recoveries. And I'm here to speak about something I did listen into your last meeting. I found it very engaging, so thank you. But I'm here to talk about, I guess I'll call it pay to track. And while the program can't say stagnant, it needs to continue to evolve. It can't continue to be stood up by one person. I'm not sure pay to track is the right way to get there. While this isn't a true public service, it is a public service, and it's part of the hunting community. Please bear with me that I'm speaking for myself, not for all the leash trackers. But I view it as a service. I view it as part of the community, a way to help hunters, a way to help hunters learn. And while I want to grow the program, I don't think pay to track is the way to get there. I think it's exposure, it's education, it's being involved, whether that's at hunter safety, whether that's in forums like this. I think, all the time the first phone call I get is, how much would it cost for you to come out? And that, honestly, it breaks my heart. My response is, you don't get paid to hunt, I don't get paid to track. My dog loves to do it, I love to do it, and we're here to help. And I want that spirit to continue. And my 2 minutes got to be just about up, but I don't see a buzzer or anything.
Yeah.
And I'd be remiss not to mention Tim Nichols and his wife, who stood this program up through the Dean administration in the 1990s. I know that they share this opinion of pay to track isn't the way to, continue to help the hunting community. Tim's been written about in Outdoor Life, Field and Stream, and probably every other publication you can think of. So I think it's important that, this group at least, hear his opinion, understand his opinion as a subject matter expert. Not a dictator, but a subject matter expert. And I want to thank you for letting me go past my 2 minutes, and I'm happy to be here tonight.
Thank you.
very much.
Actually, Mark Green, Mark Green, do you want to speak?
No, I'm good.
Okay. Rod Coronado from Orange.
Good evening, everybody. As the year's wrapping up here, I just wanted to use my time to thank everybody for their service on the board, especially the department, especially John Austin. This summer, I spent a lot of time tying into the connectivity conference that he helped organize up in Montreal. And since then, I've really been excited by the aligned goals that I've identified. And at the end of the day, what upsets me the most as a lifetime wildlife advocate is not a hunting or trapping practice, but when I'm driving on the roads and I see another animal tore apart, laying on the guardrail, especially on 89, the highway that rips the Green Mountains in two, And there's an ambitious project right now to put in a wildlife corridor there that I think deserves the support of all stakeholders. And so that's pretty much what my focus is that I love habitat connectivity because it doesn't just benefit one species. I don't know if you all saw the article in the Vermont Digger that Bree was quoted in about the recent lynx sightings, but the thing we need to do, the best thing we can do to help bring back lynx is habitat connectivity. Also, as all wildlife adapts to climate change, there's going to be a lot more movement. Animals need to cross. Our numbers are always increasing. Our infrastructure is aging. It's being replaced. We owe it to wildlife to ensure that those infrastructure replacements allow wildlife crossings, just for aquatic and for terrestrial species. So those are the big things that I hope we can all come together on, especially as we're going into the legislative session. I'm tired of fighting against other stakeholders. I want to work together to not just protect Vermont wildlife, but to see the restoration, the lynx. I'd like to see the mountain lion. I'd like to see the wolf and other extirpated species come back. And that's in the best interest of everybody. Thank you for your time. And I hope everybody has a happy new year and a Merry Christmas. Thank you.
Thank you, Ron. Hey, anybody online would like to have their 2 minutes?
Yes, I would like to speak.
Barbara Folletti?
Yes. Barbara Folletti from Huntington and Chittenden, and I would like to speak in support of the Fisher petition, and I want to thank you for your consideration of that petition. The monitoring of wildlife populations, we know that it has to be inferred from different measures, and that one of the measures the department uses is its CPUE data as an indirect index of population trends to track the growth or the decline of fur bearer populations over time. And the department's CPUE data show a 3-decade trend of decline of the Fisher population. And there is concern that this is due to rodenticides, particularly secondary anticoagulant rodenticides or SCARs. The department data show that rodenticides were present in 100% of Fisher, 100% of weasels, and 69% of bobcats tested. Now, I know that the rodenticides are regulated by the Agency of Agriculture, and that the agency did recently issue new regulations for SCARs. And I just think it's very important to be clear that the sale and use of SCARs are still allowed in Vermont if used by a certified pest controller. And while they're not sold in stores for the general public, I can still go online and have them shipped to me. So my point is that even with the Agency of Agriculture's recent regulation, SCARs are still an issue for wildlife in Vermont. And the department can't control the use of SCARs, but the board can direct the department to adapt its management practices based on the CPUE data for Fisher, and that's what I'm asking for. Unfortunately, the board did not meet in November to be able to take action before this year's Fisher trapping season. Nonetheless, I think that a moratorium on trapping Fisher is still needed, along with use of non-invasive methods for future monitoring and further research on the impact of rodenticides on all of our wildlife. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Barbara.
Next, we have Sarah Gorsline.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. I'm calling in from the road. Thank you for hearing my comment tonight. My name is Sarah Gorsline. I live in Grand Isle. I'm the Vermont representative for the national science-based nonprofit Project Coyote. I wanted to extend a warm welcome to Commissioner Shortsleeve and to mention that I look forward to working with you, the board, and the department to further wildlife protections in Vermont and help to modernize wildlife regulations. I wanted to speak tonight in support of Jennifer Lovett's Fisher petition. Again, I spoke in support of this petition in October. When the board pushed back on the notion in October that it is this board's job to regulate rodenticides, I totally agree. It's the legislature's job, and I hope to see further restrictions. I think where wildlife advocates are calling on this board to enact regulations is to help further regulate the hunting practices around impacted species, specifically Fisher and bobcats, who have both tested positive for rodenticides. So I think what we're asking for is for this board to take an additional look at regulations around those species and the hunting practice around those species specifically. I also want to mention that Project Coyote recently submitted our recommendations for the department's 2025 State Wildlife Action Plan. I'm very excited to continue working with department staff on that and to help modernize hunting regulations, also to bring them into line with the goals stated in the 2015 State Wildlife Action Plan, which the department obviously created. So I look forward to continuing to work on that and to bring hunting regulations further into line with the goals stated in that Wildlife Action Plan from 2015. Lastly, I just wanted to wish everyone happy holidays, and I look forward to working with everyone in the new year and hope to work with department staff, for example, on testimony in support of rodenticide legislation, if that is to come upon the table in front of the legislature next. Thank you for your time tonight, and happy holidays, everyone.
Thank you, Sarah.
Next is Kristen C.
Hi, my name is Kristen Cameron. I live in Burlington, Vermont, and I just want to speak in support of the moratorium on fisher trapping. I support it, and I hope you will too. In recent history, Fish and Wildlife departments have placed bag limits or stopped trapping for a period of time to let fisher recover, and I think it's time to do that again. I hope the department and the board will do what they can to protect fisher by holding off on trapping, at least while other actions can take effect. Thanks.
Thank you.
We don't have any more raised hands, but if you're on the phone and you'd like to make a public comment, you can unmute now and make a public comment.
Okay, thank you, everybody, for the inputs. That closes our public comment section. Moving on to the next item, we will be receiving the department's recommendation on the petition relative to licensed leash dog tracking. And I will turn over to the department, whoever is John. I'll turn over to you.
As long as Commissioner Short Sleeve is okay with that.
That sounds great.
Yeah.
Evening, everybody. So I know on the agenda tonight, we have 3 petitions that the department is responding to. We'll take them in order. First one regarding the use of licensed leashed tracking dogs to retrieve big game outside of the normal big game seasons. Appreciate petitioners' interest in extending these services. We think that it's a good idea. It makes sense. Our petition recommends to the board that you move forward with allowing that through rulemaking. We're not recommending at this time that you consider an explicit allowance for charging fees for those services. To the gentleman's earlier point, we think that it's important to make these services as broadly available as possible. And so to the extent that affordability becomes an issue for somebody who needs that service, we think that it shouldn't be explicitly allowed through the permits. That's not to say that a donation or something of that nature could be offered to the dog handler, but we're not suggesting that you get into the finances of that arrangement. I'll just ask if David or the major or our general counsel have any other thoughts on that proposal, but it's pretty straightforward. Yes, David.
I think one thing we just want to make sure everybody was clear on is that we're also looking to expand that to the moose. Right now it was deer and bear only, so we'd like to expand to include moose.
No, wasn't that moose on their permits before? Yes. Okay, so it's already on, so it's not expanding.
It's aligning it. Public.
You mean for after the season?
Right.
Maybe during the season and for 24 hours after, moose have been legal, I hope. Because I used one this season.
You okay? You should.
I can speak to that. There are a couple different definitions of big game that appear in different sections of the rule. For whatever reason, the definition of big game in the leash tracking dog rule is limited to deer and bear. It sounds like this should be modified so that it is consistent with standard practice and aligns with the definition of big game in other parts of the rules.
Well, I thought it was on the permits already. Which said like on 10 acres, that will keep a trend.
It is.
It is,
yes.
It's on the permits and not in the rule,
Okay.
which is why the rule should be opened.
Yep.
So can I just be clear that what currently it is the season plus 24 hours? And we are expanding it with no limit?
At any time during the course of the year.
Okay.
If, for instance, a landowner is authorized to dispatch a bear.
Yep.
And they aren't able to retrieve that animal easily, that could be done in May, June, July.
Okay.
Yep.
So it's okay. So it's there's no limitation is what
In terms of time of year.
in terms of time of year. That's what the recommendation is.
And that's what it's going to come down to is basically the rule allows for hunters during the hunting season.
Yep.
But we have a lot more instances these days with actually all of our big game species being taken outside of the legal hunting season in defense of property. And right now, the rule does not allow for a leash tracker to assist a landowner that, shot a moose because it was ripping down their sugar lines, or, somebody who had livestock killed by a bear.
Yep.
The rule currently does not allow for that. So that's the expansion that the department is going to recommend.
And the warden has to be notified, right, before that tracking takes place.
I think that would be a wise thing for the board to do. Yes.
That's what it's written.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And donate to the tracker have always been allowed and will still be allowed.
Yeah, there's nothing that restricts that, so discretion.
And just so that I understand, the reason that we don't want to allow trackers to charge is that it may discourage somebody from using that service.
That's the primary reason, but David, or Major, if there have been other considerations.
That is the primary reason. Then I'm fair about that. If there ever came to they can be allowed under the permit. There's what Hannah speak to us. There's no regulation that is against it, as John said, but it's been the practice since the beginning that it's been voluntary donations. It doesn't stop them from doing a GoFundMe and it helps out.
Okay.
They've never complained, most of the trackers anyway, not once. Like Tim and any of the guys, they do it because they love doing it. So.
That's what I've heard as well.
Yep, I mean, I've talked to Tim for 30 years. He's come in, we've discussed this forever. And he's never complained once, even if he drove 100 miles or 50 and after work or whatever. So, and a lot of the other trackers the same way. Some just don't last that long, some do. So,
It's like a labor of love.
it is, I mean, for them guys. So he does a good job. And he comes to all the meetings for the volunteer. We're doing hunter safety too. Anytime. So does a great job.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
when I read the department's recommendation, the only requirement that I could see was that it had to be the use of a tracking animal had to be reported to a warden. Now, this whole issue, seemingly from the petitioner's point of view, has come up because of animals doing damage and being required to track that animal if it's been shot and injured but not killed. Why is the department not tied the use of leashed dogs directly to animals doing damage? Because they've left it wide open as long as you report to the area warden. And I'm a little confused. If the department could explain why it's not explicitly tied to animals doing damage, I would love to hear it.
This is David Sawsville. The trackers are allowed to be used during the regular hunting seasons already and 24 hours afterwards.
Yeah,
So what we're trying to do is expand it to
that, I understand that. You're talking about outside of season use of the animal. And why isn't it tied directly to animals doing damage? Because that's the rationale for doing this.
Because anybody taking an animal outside of the season will need a depredation permit and approval from the department, and the local warden would be reviewing that. And it would be tied to the use of that dog.
And it would require statutory change, David. If it was tied to the statutes that cover that, it would be a statutory change, not a board change.
Well, then maybe in fact, the board should not be taking this up, and we should be asking the commissioner to move through the legislative process of the administration to in fact do this through statute. It's just that I don't, if we're being asked to do something for a particular reason, and that reason is not incorporated into the rules, then it seems like a blank check, if you will, and I am very nervous about that.
If an animal is struck by a vehicle and there's some desire to determine whether or not that animal is injured or dead, wouldn't that be a service that would be provided in this case?
I don't believe the way we have suggested to the board that you move forward with changes in rulemaking would prevent the use of dogs for that purpose, would they?
Don't believe so, no.
In fact, that was something that had been contemplated as we were considering this. Yeah. So yes, it's likely mostly going to relate to animals that are causing issues with property owners, but it may be vehicle collisions, and maybe there are going to be other instances where it would be helpful or worthwhile to be able to retrieve the animal, and the use of dogs would be helpful in that regard. There's all sorts of ways that animals get injured or end up being killed. So, David, I'm just trying to understand. I want to make sure that I understand what your concern is and what you would like us to try and achieve. Is it trying to make sure that we are being explicit with allowing the use of dogs? First, right now, if you could just clarify what it is you're trying to achieve with this, that would be helpful for me.
Right. I was confused of why simply checking in with a warden was the only control on the use of a leashed dog, as opposed to tying it to the reason that the petitioner brought it to the board. Now, the department may have completely legitimate reasons. I happen to agree with the example just cited about an animal that's hit on the interstate and being able to track it down and dispatch it. So, that addresses part of my concern in the answer to why there are no restrictions other than checking in with a warden. I will have to think about whether, or someone could convince me that there are sufficient situations where leashed dogs be warden.
Well,
I'm just
unless I'm
looking for a
mistaken,
little
there's others here who have far more experience than I do on this, but if I understand it correctly, landowners already have the ability to contact the local game warden and indicate or explain a situation with a big game animal that is causing damage to property, and secure permission in order to remove that animal. So that exists already, and the checks and balance is with the interaction with our Warden Services Division. What this proposal would do is simply open up the opportunity in the event that a landowner secured that permission and took it upon themselves to attempt to dispatch the animal. This is all done legally up to this point, and that animal takes off, and you would like to be able to track it and find it, and you could benefit from the help of dogs. That's what this would allow you to do. Otherwise, it doesn't change any of the existing checks and balances that are already in place.
Okay, thank you.
So I would just want to be clear. If we accept your recommendation of expanding the use to basically be year round and for the purposes as stated, and what are we changing? Are we changing the rule or are we changing statute?
We'd be changing the rule. So in section 12 right now, it does talk about when a leash tracking dog can be used. It can be used during day or night to track and find dead, wounded, or injured big game during all big game seasons and the 24-hour period immediately following the last day of the big game season. So we would have to fine tune the language, but it would be expanding that so that leash tracking dogs can also be used in other instances outside of the big game seasons. And I think maybe to David's concerns, what the department suggested in its response is not the final language. So we could be more specific if it was necessary to clarify when a leash tracking dog could be used and under what circumstances. The requirement that you contact your warden is already in there. Like that check is already built into the use of leash tracking.
Correct. Okay. So if we approve this proposal, then the department will come back to us with the proposed language changes to the rule, and we will ultimately vote on the rule
Yeah, we'd have to go
as
through the
changed.
process.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, so your vote tonight would be to decide whether or not to proceed with rulemaking.
Okay. Gotcha. Okay. Yep.
We also have to vote on the petition as presented to us.
Mhm.
Also, correct?
Well, you'd have to vote
Yep.
on whether to move, basically to take action on the petition. Yes, do you
Yep.
want to pursue a change to the rule?
I just want to say, when Mandy contacted me, I didn't necessarily agree or disagree with any of her concerns. I just thought it was worthy of board discussion, so I brought it forth. And I think our discussion did highlight some changes that were worthy, to be made. So having said that, can I make a motion to vote to accept the department's recommendations on this matter?
Okay. I have a motion to accept the department's, and I have a second. Are there any other questions for the department or for anybody before we actually have the vote?
For the sake of discussion, I was fortunate enough to draw a tag, moose tag this year. We used a tracker. We wounded one. Tracker came. I'm not going to use his name because he was supposed to be here tonight, but something happened, come up, he couldn't be here. But what he did tell me, he was very opposed to that petition. The part of the petition that would allow them to start charging. He was very opposed to that, and he said he talked to several other trackers, as Matt pointed out tonight, that most of them, anyone that he knew was opposed to them being able to charge. Their biggest concern for that was that it was going to bring people into the tracking field for the wrong reason. And the people that were already in it, if they were able to start charging, it would be very easy for them to be fraudulent, if you will. But like he said, I could have led you all through these woods tonight and charged you so much an hour. And he said, there's no way you would ever know, And he said he was concerned that it was going to open it up to too much, or the possibility of fraudulent people doing it for the wrong reason. Very much opposed.
Okay. Thank you, Brian. Any other comments or questions?
Just a
Yep.
I contacted the 4 people in my county and they were all opposed to charging. And I actually documented a whole bunch of comments they gave me. So that's where I stand on it also.
Okay, thank you, Rob. Okay, if there, anybody online, any questions, members? If not,
Mr. Chairman, Jay Sweeney, just want to clarify that the motion is to accept the department's recommendation to allow leashed tracking dogs year-round with the contact of a warden still in place, but not to charge.
that's correct.
Okay.
And to include moose as defined by big game, under big game.
Understood. Yep. Thank you.
Okay, all those in favor of motion as made by Paul, thank you. Signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, ayes have it. The board accepts the recommendation of the departments.
Does that mean, do we now need to make a motion on the petition itself? And, I mean.
That's what we just did. We just,
didn't act on the petition. I mean, we either have to approve or deny the petition or table it or something, right?
we just, I think what we just did, the department came back and recommended how we act, what action we should take on the petition. And I think that's the action we are taking by accepting their recommendation, which is laid out in those recommendations.
That's my impression as well. So
I know that
Right.
that's.
We still have to go through the rulemaking process.
Correct. That's a different step. But
I believe that's what this
Right,
decision tonight is directing us to do.
Yeah.
Is to
I
initiate.
would
the
have thought that
rulemaking
we would
process.
have had to, or should deny that petition. Just so there's so.
I see what Brian's saying. Yeah.
I feel that at least I believe, maybe, if I'm correct or not, but I would say that we have to deny that petition.
I didn't even think this was a true petition. It was just a discussion. That email that she sent me, which is printed here, I don't know if that was an official petition. I got it forth just for discussion. But
It was brought to us as a petition.
yeah.
Hannah,
Well, are you concerned that that you need to deny the petition because we're not accepting the recommendation related to charging?
Well, it's just, I mean, this rule that we just passed, or motion that we just passed, didn't even mention a petition. I mean, I would think normally that we either approve or deny a petition. And or table it, and we just totally denied that petition.
My
basically.
understanding based on this conversation is that the board voted to move forward with certain elements of the petition.
Rulemaking, to move forward with rulemaking and accepting the individual portions of the petition. The board can't do that. Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry, the board can't do that. What we have to do is initiate rulemaking.
correct, Dave. I don't think we're disagreeing with that. I think what we just voted on was that we had the presentation, the request in front of us, which is a petition. The department came back and recommended to us what components of that petition they would recommend that we accept or deny. And we just voted on that recommendation. And in my mind, accepts those recommendations on that petition as adjusted by the department's recommendation. Our next step is to move forward with those parts that we've accepted and without those parts that we've rejected in the rulemaking process, which will then occur sometime in the near future. But I think that's the steps forward that were taken and have been recommended in this motion.
Which is fine.
Yep.
Would have thought that we.
If we rejected this petition, then we would be rejecting the petition, which we're not doing. Then this would have been an action initiated by the department or by the board, and that's not what we're doing. We're really reacting positively to the majority of that petition. in my mind.
Totally okay
Yeah,
with it, just
okay.
for clarification.
It's a fair question. It's a very fair question. Any other questions about what the status of that one is? Before we
Yeah,
move on?
Mr. Chairman, as long as, when we actually do get to rulemaking, this motion does not limit what we can do with that rule. Because I am still hopeful of being able to tighten up the language in terms of specificity when you can use a leashed dog out of season. And I'm hopeful that this language doesn't preclude any discussion about any other approach.
It does not, no. What the board is just, in approving certain elements of the petition, the board has decided to move forward with rulemaking. That discussion, we can have as long and as fruitful of a discussion as we want about what goes into the rule once it's open.
Thank you.
Okay. Moving on to petition number 2.
Brad.
Yes.
Nichols has got his hand raised. You just might want to let him know that he doesn't have an opportunity to speak now.
Okay.
If you could.
Tim, can you hear us?
Yeah, we are all set. We had a question
His wife.
when it first started, but we're all set. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, we missed that.
That's okay.
Okay. Okay, next item on the agenda, item number 4, is the department's recommendation relative to petition on fall archery turkey season.
So I'm going to turn it over to Tony McCula in just a moment. Tony is our turkey project leader, based on her introduction earlier. She's taken the project over from Chris Bernier, who's been the turkey project leader for quite some time now, taking it over from Doug Blodgett, who was the previous turkey project leader. Tony's doing a great job. We gave careful consideration to the petition. We think that it has merit, and there's no good reason to not support it. In fact, if anything, it will simplify the rules around fall archery turkey hunting, align them with the archery season for deer. I think it's just, it will have a minimal effect on the turkey population based on Tony's assessment, and it will have a benefit to the hunting community because it will simplify the regulations and it will provide modest expansion of opportunities. So I'll turn it over to Tony. Tony's got a brief presentation to share with you that runs through the justification and her assessment behind our recommendation to move forward with the proposal, which would also just set us up for going through the rulemaking process. Tony?
Thanks, John. Yeah, so what John said, but I'll go into a little more detail. So I do have a presentation to share, so I'm just going to try to share my screen so that you and the remote meeting participants can see it. Good. All right, so like John said, this is in response to a petition that we received to amend the fall turkey archery season. So I'm going to start by going into what the petition is asking us to do, what our current fall archery season looks like, what it would look like if the petition were accepted, and then we'll look at some of the data from our fall turkey archery season. So the petition is asking us to align the turkey archery season with the first deer archery season, which runs from October 1st until the day before the start of the deer regular season in mid-November, statewide. Simple. Our current turkey archery season is a bit more complex than that. Currently, the whole state starts on the first Saturday in October and runs until the beginning of the turkey regular season. At which point, when there's a regular season, you can also use archery equipment. So effectively, it's also an archery season. And different WMUs, wildlife management units, have different length seasons. So it's a little bit complicated. And since under the petition, the entire state would start and end on the same day, the length of the season that would be extended varies depending on the WMU that you're talking about. So if that sounds confusing, it's because it is. So I'm going to try to explain it a little bit better using this map. So as I said, this shows the current structure of our fall turkey archery season. So as I said, the entire state starts on the first Saturday in October, and then we have a 21-day archery only turkey season. At which point after that, the regular season begins. Units A, C, and E do not have a regular season. So at that point, fall turkey hunting is done in that part of the state. Most of the state, the middle shade, follows the archery only season with a 9-day regular season, during which archery equipment can also be used. So effectively 9 more days of turkey archery hunting. The Champlain Valley has a 16-day regular season. Under the petition, the entire state would still start on the same day, except it would be October 1st instead of the first Saturday. So that's 0 to 7 days sooner for the season opener, depending on what day of the week October 1st happens to fall. This map is showing how the end of the season would change under the petition. So A, C, and E currently having the shortest season would see the longest extension, because remember, under this petition, the entire state will also end on the same day. So the shortest season now would get the longest extension, and in fact, about double, about 3 more weeks of archery turkey hunting in those units. Most of the state, the middle shade, would get 12 more days of archery season, and the Champlain Valley would get another 5 days of archery season. At the very least, this would be administratively a lot simpler and much easier for hunters and wardens to memorize, because you have the whole state starting and ending on the same day, same dates as the deer archery season. So with A, C, and E, we're talking about quite a significant additional opportunity for people to harvest turkeys. So whenever you're talking about liberalizing a season, you have to consider what's the impact going to be on your harvest. So we're going to zoom in on those units to look at what the harvest looks like now. It's very low. In A and E, most years we're looking at about 2 birds. In C, about 4. So if we assume that doubling the length of the season doubles the harvest, in A and E, we're going from 2 to 4 birds. In C, from about 4 to maybe 8. I'm confident that this would be a sustainable increase in harvest in these units. And in fact, this assumption that if you double the season, you double the harvest is actually overly generous. And I'll talk about why. This shows the daily average harvest per day of the season for the last 20 years statewide. We can observe trends like this in most of our hunting seasons, particularly big game. There's a big push on opening day or opening weekend to get out there and hunt. And after that, hunter effort and therefore hunter success starts to taper off. People fill their tags, the animals get pushed around and harder to find, or people just decide that they're done hunting. And so since the current season always starts on a Saturday, we can observe these unsurprising blips on weekends when there are more people in the field, but the overall trend is down as the season goes on. And so you can imagine if you stuck another 40 days on the end of this chart, you continue to see that diminishing return in harvest. And that's why when you lengthen a season, you don't necessarily get a proportional increase in the harvest. Case in point, remember how the Champlain Valley units F, K, and N currently have the longest season, but they're actually pretty middle of the road as far as the state, as far as the harvest is concerned. And most years, again, those units we're talking about single digits of birds for the fall turkey archery season. I should add that when I say archery harvest, I'm talking about both the archery only season and harvest that occurred during the regular season using archery equipment. The archery season makes up a sliver of our total fall harvest. The vast majority, more than 80% of our fall birds are harvested during the regular season using firearms. So manipulating the archery season is really going to have a muted impact on the overall fall harvest. And we're not proposing any changes to the regular season at this time. So our fall harvest has a lot of variability year to year. The orange bars are showing the total birds harvested through both seasons, archery and regular, for the last 10 years. And you can see how we have almost this yearly up and down pattern. And it turns out that it actually kind of mirrors one of our breeding success metrics. So the green line is data that we get from our summer brood survey. So in the summer brood survey, people all around the state are asked to submit their sightings of hen turkeys and their broods. And one of the most important metrics that we get from this data is the average number of poults per adult hen statewide. Anything, oops, where's my pointer? Anything over 3 is considered good. Oh, it doesn't show up on the screen. 3's at the bottom. So we're always way above what's considered good reproductive success for turkeys. So in Vermont, we have, as far as breeding success for turkeys, we have good years and we have better years. But you can see, even so, on the better years, the following fall harvest tends to go up. On just the good years, the harvest tends to go down a little bit. So this is just all to say that our fall harvest is more a reflection of the past season's breeding success than it is an indicator of any kind of long-term trend. Starting in 2021, hunters had the option to check their turkey online. And since then, about half of hunters have availed themselves of that option. When they do that, they are asked, what species were you actually hunting when you harvested your turkey? And over those years, on average, just under half of them say they were actually hunting deer when they harvested a turkey using archery equipment. People that pick up their bow or their crossbow and set out to hunt turkey is actually a pretty small group. And this petition seems designed to maximize the opportunity for those deer hunters that want the option of harvesting a turkey that comes within range while they're waiting for a deer. Interestingly, we didn't see a noticeable tick up in the harvest even after universal crossbows became allowed. So one of the other things we have to ask ourselves for turkeys, in addition to the impact on the overall harvest, is will it impact the spring hunt? So our management strategy for as far as hunting turkeys has been and continues to be a focus on a quality spring hunt. And that requires plenty of mature males on the landscape. So I wanted to look at what does the fall archery harvest of mature males look like. So these numbers, these are the statewide totals for adult male archery harvest. And you can see most years they're measured in the dozens. And overall, we're averaging about just over a third of the total fall harvest is made up of toms.
Are jakes, they're not considered adult males?
No, jakes are immature.
Yeah.
So to look at that another way, we can compare our fall harvest of toms to the yearly total harvest of toms, which is shown in the orange. And if you're having trouble seeing the green bars that represent the archery harvest, it's because they're tiny. So every year, our fall harvest of toms is making up less than 2% of the yearly total. The vast majority of that obviously happening during the spring season, with a couple hundred more happening during the youth season. The only time it went below or above 2% was in oh, that's right, it doesn't work on the screen. Was in 2018, when the spring harvest was way, way down. So given that, and we're expecting pretty modest increase in harvest if the petition goes through. And with just a third of that being toms, I don't think that this would have a noticeable effect on the spring season. Finally, would the petition be compatible with our big game management plan? So there are two objectives in the plan that are pertinent to this petition. One, as I mentioned, is to continue prioritizing quality spring hunt over fall hunting. And I think I've shown that we're expecting a modest increase in the harvest of toms from this increased opportunity. I don't believe that there will be a noticeable detriment to the spring season from that. Management objective 2 actually calls on us to liberalize the fall seasons when it's sustainable and in accordance with public opinion. So I think I've demonstrated that we're expecting a pretty modest increase in the overall harvest if this change goes through. So for those reasons, we're in support of the petition. It would allow greater opportunity for hunters with a slight and sustainable increase in the harvest. And it would be administratively easier for our law enforcement and for hunters to understand and memorize and know by rote when they go out in the field. That's it. Yeah.
Tony, so is the spring harvest only tom?
Bearded birds in the spring. So the majority of bearded birds are males. So you can take a mature male or an immature male, and there's about 10% of hens that actually have a beard. So they are legal.
Is there any way to gauge the survival rate from the winter on turkeys like there is for deer?
We don't have like a metric for that like we do with breeding success. The best way is to look at the spring harvest and see how it compared to the previous year.
The winter severity index that we hear a lot about for deer and the thresholds that we set for deer must have the same impact on turkeys, I would think, or maybe it doesn't.
No, I mean, yeah, winter severity definitely plays a role. And, you know, as well as like mast abundance and other things that also affects deer. So, yeah.
I think a hard frost in a winter is tougher on turkeys in a maybe deep snow, because they can't get to the ground to dig and feed at all.
Yeah.
So what's the worst case scenario that could happen here? That just we just harvest too many turkey or more turkeys than expected, and that would have the negative impact on the spring hunt.
Yeah.
It's really
So the worst case scenario is that I'm totally off track here and we actually end up harvesting a lot more toms. But that is something that would be evident in the spring. And, you know, we always have the option of saying this didn't work, and we can, you know, claw the season back a little bit if it becomes necessary.
Do we know the total population of turkeys in the state? Is that? No. Okay.
No, it's really hard to get them to line up to be counted.
I mean, from like hunter observation or.
Yeah, I mean, the best we could do is say an estimate with a margin of error of several 10,000.
Just good.
Well, there's 22 around my house right now.
I know. All week. I get a dozen.
Any other questions? Jay?
I just want to be clear, this is affecting the archery only. It doesn't affect the regular fall season, correct?
That's right.
Thank you.
Make a motion.
Everybody wants to shoot a $30.
I'll make a motion to accept the department's recommendation to expand the fall turkey season.
A second.
Okay, I have a motion to accept it in a second. Any other questions or comments? If not, all those in favor of accepting the department's recommendation signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed? Ayes have it. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, and next item on the agenda is item number 5, which is the department's recommendation relative to the proposal to have a moratorium on Fisher as a result of rodenticides. John?
Yes, thank you. Before diving into that one, I just acknowledge and to be clear with your last vote on the second petition, that puts the department in a position to initiate rulemaking. So I mean, it's a relatively straightforward change, but it will be coming back to you through the rulemaking process.
And just so that we have a sense of when would we expect that? Actually, that's the question stands for both the first and the second petition.
Good question, Mr. Chair. I think maybe we want to have a conversation at some point about the timing of some of these, some of the rulemaking processes related to petitions, because we have a fairly aggressive agenda to share with you for the winter and spring with deer rule changes, the deer and moose regulations. I know the Fisheries Division has some rulemaking that they want to explore with you. So I yield to Commissioner Shortsleeve, but I would want to be able to move forward with those more time sensitive and pressing needs prior to jumping into additional rulemaking. So we might, again, yield to you, Commissioner, but I might suggest that we look down the road a little ways before we embark on these.
Okay, well, maybe what you could do is, because part of what we got in our package this month was an outline, a calendar of meetings to come starting the first of the year. Maybe if you can modify that calendar with your proposals of when to address those rules would be a good starting point.
Good idea. Okay. Hey, regarding the next petition, the petition regarding establishing a moratorium on trapping of Fisher based on concerns related to the presence of rodenticides in the Fisher tissue samples that we have tested over in recent years. Before diving into that, and we have our Fur Bear project leader, Bree Furphy, who's going to give you a presentation tonight explaining the rationale and the assessment behind our recommendation to you concerning the petition. I just want to acknowledge and extend my appreciation to the petitioner. There's a shared interest here in making sure that we're looking out for the health and the well-being of our Fisher population, in addition to all of our wildlife populations. So no disagreement. We, and in fact, we took it upon ourselves a number of years ago, where you can share with you the history of this, to begin examining some of these carcasses that we receive from licensed trappers required by law, because we wanted to improve our understanding about the presence of anticoagulant rodenticides in our wildlife populations. It's not a new issue. It occurs in a variety of wildlife, including birds of prey. But we still have a lot to learn about the extent to which the presence of these toxicants in wildlife is having any kind of cause and effect in terms of population health, individual health. There's just a lot to learn. It's no different than every one of us walking around with mercury and lead and plastics in our system. It's a problem. We should be thinking about it, but cause and effect, there's still a lot to learn here. So I'll turn it over to Bree. We also have Dr. Geter here with us tonight, who, as she explained earlier, oversees and coordinates all of our science interests, as well as Chris Bernier, who's worked on the Fur Bear project for many years and is steeped in the history and ecology around fur bear populations. And of course, the incomparable Mary Beth Adler, who's online with us tonight, soon to be retired. She too has worked with the Fur Bear project for a very long time. This is a complicated topic because you're talking about a species with a very complicated ecology. So Bree is going to walk you through our understanding of the Fisher population in Vermont today, as well as our assessment of the full scope of data that's available and understanding the population and its health, well-being. The recommendation is, as you've seen, does not support moving forward with the moratorium, but I want to be clear that that's not to diminish the concerns of petitioner. We want to make sure that we're looking out for the interests of our fisher population and all of our fur bear populations. And if we had a sense that there was a problem, we wouldn't need a petition to come to you to deal with it. We would come to you independent, look to make a change if we thought that that was necessary. So I'll turn it over to you, Bree. You can run the board through your very thoughtful assessment today.
Well, that was really well said. Let's see here. My screen. Okay, that's good. All right. Well, thank you everybody for having me tonight to be able to present about all of this. I know it's a controversial subject. It's a problem, of course, that we're very concerned about, but I hope to elaborate on some of the misunderstandings that there are about not only CPUE data and how we collect it, but just generally how we analyze that data and how we interpret it. So to start off, for those of you that don't know what rodenticides are, think of it as rat poison. They are classified as pesticides and they're regulated by the Agency of Agriculture. And they essentially, there's different types of classifications for rodenticides. Not all of them are anticoagulants. The first generation that you usually hear of, those are the ones that are less potent. Generally, it takes multiple exposure times for that mouse to actually, or whatever animal it is, to experience mortality. So it's usually, it comes back several times. The second generation rodenticides are actually a lot more potent. Usually it's just one exposure and that animal dies fairly fast. Some of them actually affect their neurology a little bit and their nervous system. And so they don't actually die right away. They can actually go on for a period of time with modified behaviors and things of that nature that ultimately would cause their demise. Generally, when you're hearing SGARs, it's second generation anticoagulant rodenticides. So to give an overview of some of our results, as you just heard, the department is, it's a requirement to turn in any sort of trapped fisher. We also collect roadkill fisher. And every single year we do necropsies on these fisher. We've been doing it since the 1990s. We have an incredibly long data set that we can look back on and look at changes over time. And just this data is available to us every single year. So we can collaborate with researchers and we can collaborate with universities to look into different disease concerns, for example. But one of the things that we have been looking at is rodenticide exposure. So this is, like John said, it's nothing new to us. And we did 3 years of sampling. Unfortunately, most of them were positive for more than one compound. So that suggests that these animals are being exposed at more than one time. So that's obviously incredibly concerning. But I want to emphasize here that we wouldn't know what we know today if it wasn't for the regulated harvest of fisher. So if we were to remove trapping, that would take away our ability to understand what we already understand and what we will continue to learn. So we certainly have gained a lot from trapper-derived carcasses, and so removing that opportunity certainly is not gonna help us. From this information, there's been, the department has been involved with research that's ongoing, and it's resulted in 2 publications to date that have been pretty thorough, and it's taught us a lot of information that I'll go over here in just a minute. But the important thing that I just wanted to note here is just the simple fact that the department is engaged. We're working on it. We're paying attention. We are collecting samples. We're continuing to send these samples in to different laboratories. We're continuing to collaborate with researchers from other states. We're working with state-of-the-art scientists, or I guess equipment, but scientists that are brilliant, and they are working really hard. And so I just wanted to mention that we are actively participating and understanding this a lot more. Let's see. So I wanted to go over some of the pieces of information or some of the big takeaways from those publications that we participated in. And one of them is looking at where rodenticide exposure is occurring. And so this is not only in Vermont, but it's across the Northeast. And in Vermont, well, also in other states, it was defined that the wild and urban intermix is where rodenticides exposure was occurring the most. So that was surprising to us because we all expected it to be around agriculture, but instead it was around some of these areas where there's more development near forest dominated landscapes. So that's incredibly important information to know because it gives us a baseline of where to start. So we can't just assume that all the rodenticide exposure is occurring in agriculture areas, but now we have an area to start from. And then here's a quote that has been brought up a few times. I'll read it out loud. Importantly, regardless of the source of whether the AR use is legal or not, the near universal exposure of the fishers samples suggest that AR exposure is widespread and represents an underestimated health risk to wild fishers. The reason why I wanted to point this out mostly is because it is true. It does potentially have a wildlife health risk. We don't know that. This sentence is being taken out of context out of context of an entire discussion in this paper that is explaining that we didn't expect fisher out of all species to be exposed to rodenticides. We expected something like foxes or coyotes. So this sentence is simply stating in the context of that paragraph that we just didn't expect fisher to be exposed.
Is that because they're more deep forest animals?
Yeah, exactly. So compared to like foxes that might be more, preying on rodents near residential areas or, so fisher it wasn't a species that we really expected to have this issue. And lastly, what I want to mention about these publications is just the recognition that without regulated trapping, we wouldn't have this information again. So if we impair our ability to have any sort of regulated, or if we don't have regulated trapping, it would impair our ability to continue to collect this information. So it's being done at a low cost. It's being done it's very rapid and it's effective, and we get consistent data every single year. One thing that the articles don't mention is that it's causing population declines. And it's very difficult to tease out whether or not it could cause population declines. But nowhere in those articles is it saying that rodenticide exposure is causing population declines. That's really important to say, because even though it's alarming that all those fisher were testing positive for multiple compounds, it didn't actually mean that those animals were dying. They were being harvested through the regulated harvest season. Regulated trapping season. So in other words, we don't know the fate of those animals. We don't know whether or not they would have continued to live on and, die, or we don't know. There's a ton of information we don't know, but at the end of the day, the way that they died was from regulated trapping. So to go over what we know and what we don't know and why we don't know it. First, I'll go over what we know. So we know that there's high exposure rates across the Northeast. These publications go ahead and confirm that. Exposure is highest in Vermont. So Vermont is just next to New Hampshire. New Hampshire, I think, was at like 85% exposure, and Vermont was at pretty close to almost 100 for just being exposed to multiple different compounds. That's to say also in comparison to New York and Maine, I mean, it's a whole spectrum, but Vermont did stand out as being one of the highest states. So the number of compounds that were found suggests that there could have been multiple exposure times. So it could have been that that animal was eating multiple mice, or it could have been going back to the same area and ingesting different compounds. And so we didn't expect to see that either. We know that it's occurring in wild and urban intermix. So again, we know we have a baseline of where to have our future studies. And I also wanted to point out that, you know, Fisher were reintroduced in the 1960s. At the time, rodenticides were being used pretty heavily. The rodenticides have been used for the last century or so, probably heavier than they were or that they are today. That being said, we've seen Fisher populations decline. We've seen them come back. We've seen them do just fine. And this is all at the same time that rodenticides are on the landscape. So we can assume that maybe Fisher have been exposed to rodenticides this entire time. We just don't know. The important thing, though, is that they have made a comeback and they're reintroduced at the time that these compounds are on the landscape.
Bree, can you tell me okay, in the 60s, they were first generation rodenticides, right?
They may have already had.
When the second generation rodenticides were more.
I believe what I read was 1970 somewhere.
1970s. Yeah.
Was coming back.
Yep. And we got our samples from regulated trapping. What we don't know is really important. So how long has this been going on for? How long have Fisher been exposed? How long have other wildlife been exposed? Is there any way to track that? We simply do not know. Like, we can only go so far back on our data set and say, oh, maybe it started in 1990, or maybe it started in 2000. Like, we don't actually know when exposure was occurring, or when it was the highest, when it was the lowest. So it makes it really complicated to really understand this issue fully. We don't know that there's necessarily an impact. So I think that's a problem that we all tend to make is, you know, we're seeing those alarming numbers of, oh my gosh, almost 100% of those fish are testing positive. What does that mean? And we're making the mistake of saying that exposure equals mortality, or that it has an effect. And we don't know that, actually. So these samples, again, they came from regulated harvests. So we don't know whether or not those animals would have died from rodenticide, I guess, exposure. In fact, we haven't been seeing that. So that being said, we just need to be really careful when we talk about just because an animal has the compounds in it, we just simply don't know that there is an actual impact. And this is a big one too. I mean, we don't know how different species, how different age classes metabolize the different compounds. And that's incredibly important simply because we don't know, again, particularly with Fisher, we don't know if juveniles are being impacted more than adults. We don't know how their behavior impacts how often they're getting exposed. I mean, there's so much information here. I mean, yes, we know that females, it could potentially affect their reproduction, but at the end of the day, if we don't know how different species metabolize all of these different compounds and what kind of effect it might have on them, that's pretty big. And it's, you know, it's how do we know what to look out for, essentially? Whoops. So, and another point here is just simply that in order to understand all of this, we would actually need to have wild Fisher in probably a laboratory setting where we can test lethal doses and limits of what they can tolerate. And we're simply not going to do that for a variety of different reasons. We're not going to take wild Fisher into a lab setting and figure that out. This is a topic that's been in literature now for at least a couple of decades, and there's a reason why it's difficult to figure out. If we didn't have the regulated harvest that we had, we wouldn't have this information, period. So, I mean, we have to go off of what we have, and we have to acknowledge the limitations to figure out the rest of the pieces of the puzzle. All right, so going into catch per unit of effort. So this is a misunderstanding that I think is really important to go over with all of you. And it's simply just the fact that CPUE is not a population. It's not tracking populations. It is an index that we can use to interpret what might be going on with the population, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that is increasing, decreasing, none of that. It gives us a lot of information on what's going on with trapper trends. And that comes from a baseline of a lot of information. So CPUE is not, we shouldn't be looking at CPUE as the population. We need a lot more information to look at whether or not a population is increasing or decreasing, and not just CPUE alone. So this is a graph that was presented to you, let's see, 2 months ago. And this is the CPUE over time from 1990 to 2022. And I think it would be alarming to all of us when we see that really sharp decline in 2004, and we all have to kind of wonder, like, what happened there? Was that a time when, you know, rodenticide exposure was happening, or like, what happened there? And so I wanted to point out that there was a season extension at that time. So we went from a 2-week season to a month-long season. So that doubled the amount of trapper effort in relation to how much harvest was occurring on the landscape. So harvest stayed pretty much the same, but trapper effort increased. When that happens, you see the CPUE go down. So it did exactly what we expected it to do. If that season was actually a month long the entire time, this would pretty much stay the same. So it's entirely expected. And we're not alarmed to see that sharp decrease because, again, there was a season extension. So that is really important in the context of what you're looking at from 1990 to 2022 here. That doesn't scream population decline. That screams that there was a season extension. There was more effort on the landscape. Another thing about CPUE data that we all need to keep in mind is that every single one of these values is just a single number. It's just an average every single year. And so it doesn't take into consideration all of the variation of all the different trap lines from year to year. It doesn't take into consideration all the other pieces of information that we get from regulated trapping. You know, what's influencing trapper trends? We simply just need to look at that information in order to understand this. So you can't look at every single one of these numbers and say, and pretty much get like an idea of a population, what it's doing, because you need to take in consideration everything else. And you can't just look at one number and draw any sort of conclusions off of it. So wanted to point that out. So in talking about that, there's a lot of variation in the data that needs to be accounted for. And here is just a really quick example of what that variation looks like. So each one of these dots actually represents the average trap line. So you can see there's a lot more information that goes into this than just one average.
Bree, can you, on that graph, can you tell me what the y-axis is?
Yep, so that's the CPUE on the y-axis, and then the x-axis is, I'm sorry, opposite, year, and then the CPUE.
So that's like so on the y-axis, it's the number of fishers caught per 100 trap nights?
So the 100 trap nights, that is taking into consideration, like, you would have to have, so say for example, you have 10 traps that are put out for 10 nights. So 10 times 10 is 100 trap nights. So that is the effort that you're seeing. That's just a quick example of like how that is calculated. But the 100 trap nights is just a standardized way that we can look at it and compare everything over time. It's very common. It's used around the world. 100 trap nights is pretty standard to use. Does that answer your question?
I think so. So the numbers are like 20 fishers per 100 trap nights, meaning that's a trap line, not a single trap.
Yes, you got it. So it's like over time, or that person's effort essentially, and the trap, like how many traps they used, how many nights it was out for, and how many animals that they caught. So it's the what they caught pretty much divided by their effort, essentially. And it gives you a ratio, or it gives you a number that's the CPUE. So yeah, so the number here is just showing that those are the CPUE values over time. But again, each one of these dots is just the variation. It's showing the variation in each individual trap line. So it's not constant. Like there's not just one number, right? There's not just one number that basically is going to tell you what that all the information about trapping that year. You need to look at all the other underlying information that goes into it. And so you can see, this is just, again, pointing out an example of what that variation looks like. And it's not just that one number. Another graph that was shown a few months ago, again, was the CPUE with a very sharp decline. The important thing here to recognize, and the reason why I want to show it again, is to emphasize that you can't just plot out these numbers, these average numbers, onto a graph and do a regression analysis. And it's really important. This is where it gets a little bit tricky, because I don't really expect everybody to understand what a regression analysis is, but generally it's how one thing changes in relation to other factors. So if you just have one number on a graph and you draw a line, it doesn't tell you anything. Like, what is this in relation to? There's a lot of information that's missing from here. Again, the variation of every single trap line is the information that you need to run an actual statistical analysis of what that population is doing and what's impacting it. So here is just an example of, well, when we plot it out, this is what it looks like. The more appropriate way to be looking at some of this information is dividing the two time periods. So from prior to 2004 and then after 2004, because of that season change, right? We can't look at it all together because it's apples and oranges, because the effort changed so much. But we're seeing that only 1 to 2% of the variation can be explained by year alone. So that's saying that there's so many other things that go into the graph that you're seeing here and the information that essentially is not being explained by these models. So again, you can't run a regression model without all the underlying information. And the fact that only 1 to 2% of that variation is explained by year is pretty telling. So it could be trapper prices, it could be weather, it could be so many other things together. So we can't just explain it by year alone. So with all those unknown factors, it's hard to really make much interpretation from this information, but there was a decline of approximately 0.06 from 2004 to 2023. So in our post regulation change. But again, like, how do you interpret that? The interpretation of that is, okay, so there's a 0.06% decrease over time, but only 1 to 2% of that variation can be explained by year. So that's not, again, it's not telling you a whole lot. And there's a ton of information, or there's a ton that could happen, say, in the next couple of years. So say, for example, the pelt prices increase, say they skyrocket. And if that were to happen, the CPUE numbers, we would expect for those to go up. If that were to happen, that 0.06 is meaningless. We would actually see maybe even a positive net increase. So this is not actually a true decrease. And again, we're just seeing that there's a lot of variation in the data that's not being accounted for when you look at the CPUE. So the other parts of information, or the other, there's a ton of information that goes into this. And the other parts of information is that we need to look into what factors are influencing trapper trends. There's a lot of information there. Trappers also provide us information on local patterns. So for example, a trapper might find out that, hey, there's a decline in Fisher in this area, or I've noticed a decline in Fisher in this area. Can you look into it? Can we have a conversation? A lot of that's not going to show up in the CPUE data. That's going to happen in the conversations that we have with trappers on the ground. We can look at the age and sex ratios through regulated trapping. We wouldn't be able to do that without regulated trapping. So we're able to look at the population health in general and the entire recruitment and age structure of the population. And we can do this by taking a tooth and sending it into a lab in Montana, where they can have more accuracy and age the animal. Population health, again, when we do these necropsies, we're looking at all the different factors that we're taking advantage of the opportunity to collect all these samples. We can take liver samples, we can take, just general necropsy information. And again, this goes back to 1990. So this isn't something that's terribly new. We've been doing this for a long time. So we've been getting a lot of really good population health information. And then, of course, habitat use and distribution. A lot of our harvest allows us to look at changes in harvest over time across the state, if there are any. And we can also use cameras. So this is something that's not regulated trapping, but we can use cameras to look at the habitat use across the state over time and whether or not that's changing. So these are all pieces of information that goes into how we understand a population, and it's not just CPUE. All right, so trapper effort and harvest. Again, this is an actual graph of what the harvest and the effort looks like. You can see here that they parallel each other perfectly. There's actually a high pelt price here around 2014, I believe, and you can see the effort skyrocket. But in a healthy population, what you would be seeing is basically that effort staying the same or increasing, and then you would see the harvest decreasing. So those would be like red flags. But here we're not seeing that. We're seeing that the two parallel each other pretty perfectly. So that's a really good indicator that there's a healthy population out there. We're not seeing that fishers are dropping off the landscape that trappers are not capturing. This can be caused by a variety of different things. Fur market changes, like I just went over, you can have spikes, you can have lows, that all impacts the information that we have, of course. And then high gas prices, people need to work, people don't necessarily have the time that they once had to go out and trap. And so all of that can influence the trapping information that we have as well. So just because things look like they're declining here, you have to ask the question of like, well, why, right? We have lower prices, lower pelt prices, higher gas prices. Weather could be a factor because weather certainly will affect the animal's behavior and therefore it affect the trapper's behavior. They're not probably going to go into an area to try to trap fisher if they don't see any sign for it. So that can really impact things. So the decline that you're seeing here is not a population decline. It's just simply showing that there's less participation and there's things that impact that the lower participation.
Ray, one other factor I'd like to point out is the skill base of the trappers that are out there every year. That's the older, more experienced trappers they're aging out, and a lot of them are trapping less or not, or eventually not at all. So that also affects your CPUE.
It could, yeah. Yeah, experience certainly could play a role for sure. Okay, so the other pieces of information that we get from our regulated harvest is our age ratios in the population. So we can see here, this graph probably looks really confusing to you, but this is a breakdown of the age structure of our regulated harvest every single year, going back to 1990. So the graph, so you can see down here in the bottom, or maybe you can't see, but I'll point it out for you, is that you have ages 0 to 5. So ages 0, meaning that is a juvenile that was just born that year. 1 is still a juvenile, right? It's already recruited into the landscape. It's moving around. It's not quite an adult. And then you start getting into the 2 to 5 age. That's going to be an adult. So if you're considering all that, you can see that actually the majority of the harvest is all juveniles. And that's exactly what we would expect to see in a healthy population, because there's more juveniles on the landscape. They're moving around a lot more. They have larger home ranges. They're a little bit thicker in the head. And we would expect to have more juvenile harvest. If we were to see more adults, especially adult females being captured, then that would be a reason to be concerned. If we started to see that trend switch. Because the adult females, they have smaller home ranges, and generally it would indicate that, like, where are the juveniles on the landscape? So this is telling us that there's healthy recruitment. This is telling us that it's consistent from year to year to year. And again, well, one thing I want to point out just down here, not to confuse anybody, but it doesn't mean that anything is decreasing. It just means that there's less harvest. So the trend is the same. We're still having more juveniles being harvested than adults.
Bree, do we know, or do you know? I don't, obviously, but do you know whether or not juveniles or the kids inherit any of the compounds from that they're passed on?
I don't know. I think that's a piece of information that, you know, I think there's literature on potential reproductive impacts, but that's under a setting where there's compounds that are very concentrated. And so there could be differences in how the animals are moving around and using the landscape, what prey resources they have. And it kind of goes back to just how complex this is, and just reiterating the fact that, you know, we don't have the answers. And we don't know if the young ones are getting, or if the juveniles are being impacted. Don't know. So, yeah. So again, here's juvenile recruitment. So anything that's over that red line being 2 juveniles per adult, indicates that this is a healthy population. We're seeing a lot of juvenile recruitment in the population. One would argue that it's potentially even increasing here, but the point is that it's stable. It's above that threshold of a healthy population, and that's good. That's exactly what we want to see. If the population was tanking, then again, we'd start to see that ratio go down. So
How do you get that info?
we get this information from the teeth data. So when we have the regulated harvest, we do our necropsies, we take a tooth and we send it to a lab, and it gives us the age. And so we can look at the age, the sex, and we can collect all that information together to look at our harvest ratio.
And an increased juvenile harvest recruitment, that might indicate an expanding population, maybe possibly.
There's a lot of information that goes into it. You know, I mean, there's a lot of things to consider. The important thing here is just simply that we're not seeing any reason for concern in the population because we have really good juvenile recruitment. And we can also, before when I was telling you a little bit about the health condition of the population, again, during our necropsies, we can collect these samples, we can get weights on them. And weight generally is a really good way to look at the health status of a population, especially for females. Because if rodenticides were impacting them, we would expect changes in their immune system, their ability to capture food. We would see changes in their weight, essentially. And again, we don't know how far to look back at, but if you just compare the samples that we took during that 3-year period with the data set of all of the weights that we have for Fisher, there's no changes. They're literally almost the same. So we're not seeing a decrease in the weights at all. We're not picking that up, but we're going to continue to sample, and we're going to continue to take weights, and we're going to continue to, you know, look into other factors that could be affecting them. So through our camera work, we have hundreds of cameras that are deployed across the state. And so these cameras, they provide us a ton of information that's used in conjunction with the information that we get from regulated trapping. So it confirms what we already know through our trapping, is that they are widespread, they're abundant, they're using, they're actually one of the more common species that's detected on camera, and that they're using their habitat use generally is really good for the state. So this green line, or the green mapping there, shows that there's high probability of habitat use. And then this is the lower spectrum. This is where you wouldn't expect to see them. So like, I don't know, in a lava field or in a sand pit. But generally the Vermont is showing that that Fisher occupy pretty much all the habitat that they possibly can. And so they're frequently detected on camera. And that's to say that we continue to collect them on camera. We are looking into multi-year occupancy models. When I say occupancy, I mean like habitat use. So what we could do is look at these cameras data over time and look at whether or not there's changes pretty much in habitat use over time. And right now we're sitting on a 10-year data set that we could start to begin to analyze those data.
I'm surprised Maine doesn't have more green, to be honest, you know.
Yeah.
It's a lot of good habit. I know there's a lot of martin in Maine, so it might have an impact. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know Maine very well, so.
Can you tell me why the northern greens are not included in camera trapping? Is that just the way the study was set up?
Yeah, I think the study was set up that way. There's people here that have a lot more history with this than I do. But I believe that during the time that it wasn't necessarily set up specifically for Fisher, it was set up for multiple species. And so they were put in areas where we were targeting those species. And so Fisher is just a really good example of another species that we catch on camera, that we catch more often than we expect to, similar to bear. So say, for example, these cameras were put out to specifically look at moose. Then we all of a sudden have all this Fisher data that's coming to us from these cameras, then we can get this type of information. So it's not necessarily targeted towards Fisher, but it can still give us a lot of information. The cameras are kind of a multi-species study. Oh, and also this project is very costly. It's $160,000. So keep that in mind when we're talking about the benefits of regulated trapping. It's being done for free, and it gives us a ton of information that cameras can't replace. Oh,
670,000 over 4 years, actually.
I got a different, okay. So 670,000 over 4 years. So that gives you a little bit more of a complete picture of how much it costs to not only work with universities and other governmental agencies, but also staff time, the cameras themselves, the batteries, all of this. It's an immense amount of work and effort to get all of that camera information. And it just it gives us a lot of good information, but it can't replace regulated trapping. It could certainly supplement it. So here's a picture that was taken recently that I just wanted to share with everybody. So this was just taken on the 10th of December. So right now we have cameras that are going out for martin, and sure enough, we get Fisher all the time. So this is a picture that was just taken the other day. So are there other methods for collecting information on rodenticide impacts on fur bearers? There really isn't. We can look at roadkill data, sure, but the roadkill data, it's not going to give us nearly enough samples that we would need to accurately assess what's going on. It wouldn't give us the sample size that we need that we get from our regulated harvest. Additionally, the roadkill samples, they're being found in a variety of different pretty much like decaying process. So it's the condition that they're in can actually really impact the sample quality. So if you have an animal that's been sitting out there in the sun for more than a day, for example, like the samples that you can get from that to test it for rodenticide exposure would be useless. So it's really the condition of the animal that you need to have there. It has to be in good condition. Taking blood samples, sure, we can catch Fisher and collect blood, but catching Fisher is not only incredibly time-consuming, expensive, and dangerous, it's really stressful on the animal to the point where you probably wouldn't want to do it just for collecting blood samples. Additionally, it's not going to give you the same information that you get from a liver sample because the blood samples are not going to give you the exposure that animal has had. So it's only going to give you a tiny picture of that exposure because all of those compounds, they accumulate in the liver. So that's why you need a dead animal. That's why you need a liver sample. You need to be able to compare these liver samples to multiple other areas as well. So in the literature, you're going to see oftentimes they're sampling liver samples. So you can't just take blood and expect it to be the same level of exposure as a liver sample. It's going to be much different. So it's not accurate. So fecal samples, again, this is really expensive. And to date, don't know that that's actually a viable method for looking into rodenticide exposure. You can get a lot of other information from it that's really useful, but it's not going to give you any information on the rodenticide exposure. And same thing with hair sampling. It's an awesome method. All of these methods are great. It's just all of them have limitations, and none of them are going to give you any idea about exposure, except for that liver sample. And just for perspective, so we're only harvesting 100 to 150 fisher right now. So that's less than 1 fisher per town. So that's not a whole lot of harvest, right? So if we're having an issue with fisher and we're having an issue with trapping, we would probably expect that number to be a lot higher. So we would like if there was 1,000 fisher being trapped every single year, that would be concerning. But we're only getting 100. Again, that's less than 1 fisher per town. So it's not really doing anything, actually. It's less than like 1% of the actual population. So there really isn't that much harvest to make a dent in the population. There's no scientific evidence at all that trapping is causing any sort of population declines. And there's no scientific evidence to support that rodenticides are causing population declines. As much as we would love to know this, there's no support for it. And as you guys are learning, we're not seeing it in our population, our fisher population. Just to start wrapping this up here soon. So another piece of information that I want to address is the relationship with marten. Fisher trapping is not impacting marten. It's a state endangered species. We are studying them. But what we know about the relationship with fisher and marten is simply that fisher could actually be limiting marten from being able to expand here in Vermont. So it could be like one of those limiting factors that because of the density of fisher, we may not actually have enough marten in the state. So that's pretty well documented in other states as well. And we don't know that for sure here, but we're seeing a very similar trend in the information that we do have. In areas where we do expect to capture marten on video or on cameras, we're actually seeing a lot of fisher. So the fisher population in New Hampshire has actually declined. So that is a completely different story than Vermont. But just to let you guys know that the fisher population at the time that it decreased, the marten population increased. So it's not, we need to keep that in mind that fisher trapping is not impacting the marten population. And also to point out that it was the regulated trappers that were responsible for the marten reintroduction in the 90s to begin with. So trappers themselves want to see marten expand and do well in Vermont. And lastly, do we need a quota? The answer is no. And here's a comparison with New Hampshire. New Hampshire has historically always had a fisher trapping bag limit. It's varied over time. Right now it's 2. What you're seeing here is the CPU trend that's over time, but they didn't look at this graph and say, oh my gosh, the population's declining. They actually figured out that the population was declining from people being able to share that information with public participation, with trappers. People were sharing that information long before they were starting to see anything in CPUE. So that information was crucial. And so they only have a 3 to 4% participation rate in fisher trapping. So it's so low to the point where catching 6 fisher this past year is not surprising. It's because you have a bag limit of 2 fisher and no one's doing it. So you would expect those numbers to go down. But their population decline, they suspect it has more to do with actual bobcat density and the fact that there's a lot of bobcats that are not harvested in New Hampshire. And so they are testing that theory out right now to figure out what is limiting fisher populations and what's causing their decline. But like I said, they expect it or suspect it to have to do with the density of bobcats that they have. So the point is here, I mean, even if we had a regulated, even if we had a quota, it wouldn't impact anything. So when they had a quota back in, I don't know, 2001, I believe their harvest was like in the thousands. So even with a quota then, they still had tons and tons and tons of harvest. And that didn't do anything. It didn't cause a population decline. Quota in this case, it didn't really work. And like I said, it's varied over time. So, oh, okay. So the last thing I want to share is just what are we planning on doing with all this information? So for one, we're going to continue to collect samples during from our regulated harvest and also roadkill if it's fresh enough. And we are currently collaborating on a multi-state study that's looking at the fisher population health as a whole across the Northeast and not just in Vermont. So luckily in Vermont, because we have a healthy and a robust population, it's really good samples to contribute to other states that don't have a really healthy population, like in New Hampshire. And so we're currently contributing to that. We're going to continue with our camera modeling, and that's going to, again, give us multi-year comparisons that we can look at for habitat use. If we're starting to see that habitat use is decreasing or shifting in any sort of unusual way that we wouldn't expect, that would be a red flag, but we're not seeing that right now. So that's going to be really important information to continue to track. And we're going to continue to work with the Agency of Agriculture to share any information that we do have regarding the results of any sort of testing and any results from other states. And so far, they've been incredibly cooperative and really want to learn more about how fish are being impacted or how other species are being impacted. So we're going to continue to collaborate with them, and we're going to continue with education and continue to share these results with the public to make sure that everyone knows that, yes, these fish are exposed, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there's an effect. So you can't, if we got rid of regulated trapping on fisher, the rodenticide impacts are not going to change. So that's the reality of it, unfortunately. So we want to continue with that education to let people know that this is occurring on the landscape, word of mouth, you know, so let's continue with that. And I believe that's it. Happy to take questions.
So regarding the petition, implementing moratorium on fisher trapping will only hinder the efforts towards figuring out what's going on with fishers and rodenticides.
That's correct. Yeah, to be perfectly clear, that's correct. Where the only information that we have today, and the only reason why we know it, is from regulated trapping. Right now, we're getting all of our samples from regulated trapping. We can't get it any other way. So to contribute to this multi-state effort that we have currently going on, we need regulated trapping to do so. We need those carcasses. They're fresh, you know, and they give us a sample size that's comparable. So in order to learn more, yeah, regulated trapping is the way to go.
You just go over again. So I was, so CPUE would decrease after a season extension. That's kind of what Tony said. So as the season goes on,
you have more time.
Catch.
Not necessarily. So what you would see is this, the capture staying pretty much the same, or potentially it's going to just stay the same pretty much, but you have more effort. So in other words, that ratio is going to cause that population in the CPUE, not the population, but that CPUE number to dip. That's exactly what we would expect, is that it almost like gets cut in half, essentially.
I know you weren't here then. Why would the season have been extended?
Well, that was also before my time as project leader. But I was putting words in Kim Royer's mouth, who preceded me as a program project leader by saying this, but it was all evidence was that we had an expanding fisher population, which we did clearly, and there was an opportunity for that expansion. And it was being requested by trappers at the time because a 2-week window, which was what it was prior to 2004, is a really short window of opportunity for trapping for a specific species, particularly in December, which is when it is. access becomes difficult, weather starts to hinder your ability to get out there, and trappers really wanted to have a little bit more time to be able to catch even a few fish. And so the combination of an abundant resource and a desire amongst trappers and, you know, the kind of like Tony was suggesting with, you know, you double the season, but you're not looking at the doubling of the catch. So it was a sustainable increase. And I think, you know, it's played out that way. Same season since 2004. No apparent impact on the population.
So, okay, so with best management practices, if I'm correct, I haven't waded through them yet, so I don't know, but trappers are required to check their traps every 24 hours.
Yeah, on land and every 3 days for water sets.
So, if at the beginning of the season they catch a lot of fishers and then that declines over time, and isn't that kind of working against human nature to ask people to keep going out every 24 hours to check traps when their catch rates are declining over the season?
Well, so again, we have to keep in mind that there's so many things that impact the motivation of somebody who might be trapping, right? It could be their interest in the outdoors. It could be the motivation of pelt prices. It could be that the weather is good and there's a good, you know, chance of finding fish or sign. So there's a lot that goes into all those motivations, but generally speaking, I mean, your catch is not going to necessarily go down. How many traps you put out and how many nights you put them out for. And if you're a trapper who knows what they're doing, not to suggest that people don't know what they're doing, but who's been doing it for a really long time, you know, you would expect that trapper to be successful. And so I think even over a month from that 2-week extension, we're not necessarily, there's no change in the amount of harvest necessarily per trapper. So there's not really a difference at all, actually. We did look into this statistically to figure that out, and there wasn't. So on average, yeah, the amount of harvest per trapper did not change. The amount of harvest overall changed, but.
And you probably looked into this as well, but not all trappers would start on day one of the season.
Right. Yeah.
That extension of the season probably just allows them a little bit more flexibility in working with weather conditions. They like to have snow on the ground so that they can better determine where to put their trap lines. And so they're probably not all starting on day one. Right?
That's absolutely correct. And they could have trouble getting time off of work. You know, their schedules might not allow it. They might not be able to afford the gas. Like, who knows? Yeah, but they're not necessarily starting on the first day of trapping season. So yeah, I think that weather probably has a pretty big role as well.
And one thing I want to make clear is that they're required to check the traps every 24 hours because you don't want to leave your animal in there longer than that. So they're still going to be checking those traps. It's might not be targeting fish or unless they're saying, but they're required to go out there other than that are underwater.
A couple of things that, like, fish are extremely wide-ranging travelers. And it may take a week before a fisher will come back through a certain area. So that's one of the reasons also the big season was extended. If you have a 2-week season, you maybe have 2 cracks at a fisher in a certain area for them to come through. And typically, when a fisher is caught in one area, most fisher trappers will pull their set from that area and move to a different one. Just because they are wide ranging and they have big territories. So you're not going to catch like half a dozen fisher in one area like you would raccoon or something. You catch one, you pull out, you either pull your traps or quit, or you move to new areas. And fisher trappers are constantly doing that.
So even the juvenile ranges don't overlap pretty much. I mean,
Well, their ranges won't be as big as say as a males of the large, but general fisher are wide travelers, even the juveniles. So, and they're dispersing, they're having their first year on their own. And So they're dispersing, finding new territory. So fish are a very wide range tribe. They could have a circuit 50 miles.
Yeah, so the juveniles are the ones that are moving across the landscape the most. Next to that is the adult males. They also have large home ranges, but they're just going to be less abundant on the landscape compared to the juveniles. And then adult females would have the lowest home ranges, or smaller home ranges.
And on your data about the anticoagulant rodenticides in let's see, fishers that tested positive for anticoagulant versus in your paper, you said there wasn't a control group that had no rodenticides. It said unknown.
Right.
So isn't that if like, I don't know what your database is, but if all the fishers in Vermont essentially have rodenticides in them, aren't you just comparing fishers with rodenticides?
We don't know. I mean, I pointed that out specifically to make that point, is that, again, we don't know how long they've been exposed for. We don't know years that they've been most exposed or less exposed. We just simply don't have that information. We have now a data set that we can look back on and to start looking at that a little bit more closely. But generally, we're not like, the range of weights are what we assume is normal for Fisher in Vermont based on that long data set that we have. So we're not seeing like huge spikes in their weights, or we're not seeing like low lows either. We're seeing them all within the same range weights that they should be in. So even if they are exposed, or even if they're not exposed, either way, it's just good to see that the ones that we know are exposed are not different from the ones that we didn't test.
And that data goes back to the 1990?
Yes. Yep. Yes. Although 2010 was the first year that we actually, I believe, took weights.
So to clarify, that's the weight data. It's not the exposure test.
Right. Yeah. So that's just weight data. Yes. Yes.
Great. For clarification for everybody, trappers are required to check their traps daily. Does not say 24 hours anymore. Used to, now it says daily. For a very specific reason.
What's the reason? I'm just curious.
The reason is, easiest way for me to explain this is if you have to be at work at 8 o'clock every day, some days you get to work at 7:57, and other days when things aren't going quite right, you get there at 8:02. And if the law says you will be here at 8 o'clock every day and you're there at 8:01, now you're a criminal, and that wasn't necessarily the intent.
Is he checking a lot of other animals too?
Yeah, so we're also taking samples from bobcat, which is also a harvest that is required to be turned into the department. And we've also taken samples from otter, and that's another species that we have that's required to be turned into the department. So with those three species, we continue to take samples.
And they're finding that in them too.
They're in bobcats, yes, but not the exposure levels that we're seeing in Fisher.
The otter must be very minimal, if at all, right?
Don't know yet.
Yeah.
So
in that line, so for clarification, has there been any evidence of compromised health in the carcasses of those Fisher and bobcat?
no, and thanks for pointing that out, actually. I forgot to mention that. So of the samples that we took, the 71 samples that we took over the 3-year period, all of them were in good health condition. So they were of good body weights. A lot of them had a good amount of fat on them. We scored them as being good or in excellent condition. A lot of them were. I think there was maybe like 2 that were desiccated or potentially not in good condition. But all of them, essentially, almost all of them were in really good condition. Again, it makes it really difficult to track, like, how are rodenticides impacting them? If we're seeing them in good condition, we're seeing the population doing just fine. We're seeing their weights, within normal levels. All of this information, their juvenile ratios are good. It just makes it really tough. But yeah, all of them were in really good condition.
So I did run across a study from California, where they were looking at bobcats. And the woman was a geneticist, not a wildlife biologist, but she was looking at gene expression of bobcats that have been exposed to rodenticides. And they found evidence that it was causing all kinds of immune issues, immune issues. So like fish were actually dying of mange, which they didn't consider previously to be a lethal disease.
Yeah, absolutely. That is well documented. I think the important thing that I wanted to just note here is that like those samples in California were in completely different environments. Their prey base was different. Their metabolism could have been different based on the samples that they were taking. So we don't know like at what level will it cause immune function issues. We don't know at what level it's going to cause reproductive issues. We just simply don't have that information. We have that information there in California, but we can't necessarily compare that information here in Vermont because fish are across the landscape and they're using completely different resources than they are in California. So I believe it was the marijuana farm studies. Those did document mortality rates with rodenticide exposure. But again, those are much like denser concentrations of rodenticide and much denser concentrations of Fisher. So you're not dealing with a landscape where fish are like everywhere and they're super abundant. It's just completely, it's two different comparisons. But it is information that we do look into for sure. We would expect to see maybe mange be a health condition. We're not, or that it would increase, but we're not seeing that. So, yeah.
Do we get a lot of reports about sightings of Fisher? Yeah, if the ag setting isn't where, you know, not that it isn't, but it is, if it's much greater than just the ag setting where they're getting exposed to this potentially, if I understood you correctly?
So to clarify, so we expected it to be maybe more in agricultural settings, or areas that would be adjacent to agricultural settings. But it was actually in this urban forest land intermix. So in those areas, that is where exposure was the highest.
In Vermont, are we hearing of people seeing fishers in these areas?
Yes.
We are.
I think, I want to mention too, like damage wise, we're not getting any calls about Fisher causing damage in these areas. A lot of times we'll just get photographs of people like looking at Fisher on their Ring camera, just excited to share it or just excited to know what it is. So yeah, that happens often. Yeah, but we don't get calls about damage generally. Any other questions? So we could talk about this all night long.
So I just have a comment. Yeah. So this past summer there was an article in Northern Woodlands magazine, probably saw, saying what's happening to the fishers or what happened to the fishers. And they were talking specifically about New Hampshire and also Minnesota. And so it's like that magazine probably has a pretty wide distribution, and so it's like you look at that kind of information, and you look at CPUAP data from Vermont. It's like, oh my goodness, so it's like, yeah, it seems like it would be really useful to present your information to a more public audience.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think that the Northern Woodlands article is bringing light to the issue. And I think that's really important just to begin with, right? Like if they didn't publish that, maybe there's a lot of people that didn't even know that. Maybe it helped to influence individual people's decisions. We don't know. So that type of public education was actually really important. But I hear what you're saying for sure, because it is very nuanced. It's very complicated. It's difficult for everybody to understand. It's easily misinterpreted. It's just, that's how CPUE data is, so.
Do we know for certain if mice are the patient zero of this sort of thing? I mean, how is it getting into the fishers? Is it through mouse to cat to fisher? Is it water? Is it direct contact?
We don't know. So we don't know. There's a variety of different like ways that they can be getting exposed, right? Like, so they could be eating mice that have been exposed. They can be eating something that ate the mouse. I mean, there's a variety of different ways. They're probably not eating the bait directly. They're probably getting it from their prey base. But there's a lot to learn.
And we know the exposure rate is high, right?
Yeah.
I just want to come back to that word and confirm that your testing does state that a lot of these fishers are, if not close to 100% of them, have had some level of exposure.
It was exposed at one point. Yes.
Yep. But we have a lot to learn about where they're getting that exposure.
Yeah.
And your data does not point at this point in time to mortality as a consequence of that.
No. Again, just to reiterate, we would expect to see that in our juvenile ratios. We would see a decline in the juvenile ratios. We would see changes in just what the graph of trapper effort and harvest looked like. We would see those lines continuously get farther and farther apart. We would see they wouldn't be as abundant on the landscape. We wouldn't be picking them up on camera. There's just a variety of different things that go into assessing a population. That it's just not CPUE alone, right? And so all of the other pieces of information that we have is not indicating that we have a population issue. And also wanted to just state that populations fluctuate naturally. So, a population may increase or decrease at any given time, depending on the resources that are available. Vermont boasts the most conserved land, I believe, in the Northeast. And with that, I mean, that could be a contributing factor for why fish are doing so well here compared to other states. We don't know. But it's important to note that too. I mean, we have really good habitat for them and they're widely distributed, they're abundant, and all that information is giving us clues that they're doing okay.
All these compounds that are potentially lethal, are they man-made compounds that are there? Are they natural compounds in any sense that some of these compounds could be found by fishers out in the woods today because of climate change?
Yes.
Versus, being manufactured.
Yeah, there are a few of those compounds that are found naturally in nature. I don't know how they would be exposed to those or if historically they were exposed to those. I think they fall under the first generation or the first generation class of rodenticides. But generally, like something like Werafin, which is a blood thinner, these are potassium protagonists. So in other words, they're going to not allow blood clotting to occur. So that occurs naturally. Like Werafin is actually naturally occurring in nature, but I wouldn't know how exactly they would be exposed to that.
It's just interesting, especially this fisher, because again, they're such deep forested animals.
Right. Yeah.
How they get exposed to it without coming into the urban areas, and it's just, I don't know. It's just hard to comprehend.
Well, they're that deep forest. I found a dead one on the road.
Well, not all of them. No, not all of them. But when you select your 10 carcasses to take tissue samples from, I mean, you're choosing where they were harvested from. How are they distributed? I guess across Vermont.
For asking that question. So yeah, they were evenly distributed across the state. So we were very selective of like what areas we were sampling from to give that even distribution across all habitats across the state. So, but now we're taking samples opportunistically whenever there's a good carcass to be able to take that from.
So is it because of their wide range that they're in agricultural areas where there may be more poisons versus national forest where there might not be any? But yet because of their range, they are still exposed.
Oh, I mean, never say never. It's, it could be anywhere really. But generally it's in the areas that.
Where I live, national forest is just over the hill.
Right.
And then there's farms and pastures. they're 20 miles from each other, not even.
Mhm.
So
I believe Katie wanted to say something.
So some of that research that Bree was referring to on rodenticides across the Northeast region, the graduate student who worked on that research actually looked into aerial imagery and like what is the definition of urban and that urban wildland interface. And she actually found that road densities, if you account for every type of road densities are actually very much higher than you would think. So deep forest actually encompasses a lot of dirt roads with houses on them. And even if those houses aren't occupied, they have rat poison out all the time because maybe if you're visiting it once a year, you don't want to visit and have a bunch of mice running around. So there's a lot more rat poison that's applied even in those deep forest areas. That's what she found anyway.
Yeah, that's why I was saying like never say never. Yeah.
Where does a mouse go from a house down after it eats?
How much mice does a fisher need to eat on any given day?
I think the notion that fish are like wilderness animals is somewhat being dispelled. They're become quite adaptive and where they can live, but you see them all over now. And right near houses.
Any more questions?
Well, I just want to thank you for putting all this time and effort into this response.
Yeah,
It was really interesting.
it's a lot, you know, we are concerned about this, right? We are taking it seriously. We're contributing to the science. We're all working together on it. We're going to continue to work together on it, you know, and it's worth taking a deep dive into the data every single year just to make sure that, you know, there isn't any impact and what we would expect to see in these populations if there was an impact, right? So we're tracking these changes over time. Good news is that we're not seeing any population declines. So yeah, it's definitely really important information to look into, and we are taking it very seriously.
Thank you, Bree.
Thank you. Thanks, Bree.
Okay, so we have a recommendation from the department not to impose a moratorium on Fisher at this point, based on the presentation that we just received from Bree.
I make a motion to accept the department's recommendation on the Fisher petition.
Okay,
Second.
and I have a second. Mike, you look like you have a question.
Yeah, I would have expected we'd have an accept or deny of the petition.
What did I, oh, okay.
Instead of accepting a recommendation to deny.
Been through this already. I was thinking the same thing, but
Do you want to withdraw your petition,
Yes,
and resubmit
I make a recommendation to deny the petition. The Fisher petition regarding the moratorium on trapping.
I'll second that.
Okay. So we have a motion and a second to not accept the petition based on the department's presentation. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed?
Aye.
Okay, that's a unanimous aye. Any opposed, just to make sure? None? Okay. Thank you much. Thank you very much to all the individuals that made presentations tonight. That was very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, that's the last item on the agenda at this point for relative to those actions. Commissioner, congratulations on your first board meeting.
Thank you.
I don't know if you have any update for us, any comments. You're welcome to have the floor and share anything you want.
Yeah, I'll just real briefly introduce myself. I know the roads are not great right now, so we probably don't want to stick around too long to listen to me. But yeah, my name's Andrea. Like I mentioned before, I've been working for the department as a habitat biologist for the past 8 years. And so I've been in our lands and habitat program working with private landowners specifically, but also other natural resource professionals, foresters, ecologists, looking at habitat across the state. Prior to that, I worked for 10 years for the U.S. Forest Service out in Montana and Idaho as a district biologist. So I worked on species ranging from wolverines and wolves to peregrine falcons to bighorn sheep and everything in between. And was a wildland firefighter for a few years after college. I have a graduate degree in human dimensions that came from Colorado State, and a master's degree, I have an undergraduate in wildlife biology from McGill University. Grew up in Vermont, and I'm very happy to be back here and serving the department in this interim role for now. A couple updates, I guess, thinking about the board. As John mentioned, we're going to be working on bait fishing rules, commercial fishing, and as well as proposing some deer and moose rules in the coming months. We had planned on doing a presentation today on Vermont conservation design, which hopefully everyone has heard about. It's basically our blueprint of moving Vermont into the future, making sure our ecological function is happening. And we were going to have Bob Zano come in, and he does a really great job explaining that. And just in the context of this, we've seen how habitat is so important to our wildlife populations. And so having that explained to the board will be great. But we're going to move that down, I think, in the agenda. We just wanted to make sure everyone had enough time to discuss these petitions properly. Just also a note that we currently have a vacant seat, and we will be having 3 more in the next few months as people rotate out of their commitment to the board. So just something to be thinking about as we move along. And so with that, I don't have any other updates. Tony, Bree, thank you so much for the presentations. They were really great. Talks to the science that we do so well here. And thank you to the rest of the staff for being here. Really appreciate it.
Any board members have any questions for the commissioner or just amongst ourselves? Hearing none, saying none. I have a motion. All right. Jay, you have a question? Are you all set?
I just want to make a comment. January or Yankee Sportsman's Classic Sportsman Show in Vermont's coming up January 17th through 19th. Somebody mentioned that some of these presentations could be made to the public. So I do all the seminar scheduling, and if there are any presentations that the agency would like to make in an hour slot at the Sportsman Show, just let me know and I can make some space for you. I think this is important stuff. And if you think it'll be beneficial to the public to see any of this stuff beyond the board meetings, just let me know and I can make it work. Hope to see everybody there. Have a good holiday.
I would just like to add the same thing too. I think the actions that we took tonight are clearly based on the data that's presented to us from the department, the scientific data presented to us by the department. And that tells us very clearly, especially on the third one that we addressed tonight, that the data speaks for itself. But I think unless we get that message out there in some short form way that's understandable to the public, the message is going to be that we're catering to trappers. And so and that's not at all what was taken into consideration tonight. It was the data that was presented to us. So how we get out ahead, not even get out ahead of that, it's share that information so that the general public who's hearing about this decision understands why and what the data was. And it doesn't have to be a 10-page or 15-page report. It has to be an executive summary in layman's terms of how we got to where we got. I just think that goes a long ways to just people understanding the decisions that we're making. And from the department's perspective and the board's perspective, I think it'd be very helpful. So Jay, I think you're spot on too.
Mr. Chair?
Yeah.
That's an excellent point. And so I would just acknowledge that we completely agree with you. And our staff and the outreach division have already been working on something along those lines. So that should be ready for to share with the public
tomorrow.
Excellent. Great, thank you. Okay, so we have a motion second to adjourn. All those in favor, signify by saying aye. Opposed?
Okay.
Meeting adjourned.
Okay.
Thank you. They did a great job. Did a fantastic job.
A lot of information.
Yes, it is.